courtroom felt colder than anything I had ever stood inside. Nina leaned close and said, "Everything we gathered is ready if you say the word we begin." I nodded slowly and said, "Begin." The judge called the room to order, and I heard Ryan's voice for the first time in a long time. He said, "This is all false. Someone is trying to destroy me." I whispered under my breath, "No, I'm just showing the truth." Nina stood up and said, "We have documented evidence of inheritance fraud, financial manipulation, and identity exploitation." Ryan suddenly laughed and said, "This is ridiculous." But I stayed silent, watching him carefully. Nina continued, "All actions were traced back to Mr. Ryan Cole, beginning before the plaintiff signed any document." I saw his smile fade slightly. He said loudly, "That's impossible." The judge said, "Order." Nina placed the files on the table and said, "Bank records, contracts, and internal communications confirm it all." I finally stood up. Ryan looked at me and said, "Adam, what is this? Are you behind this?" I looked at him and said, "You asked what this is. This is everything you did to me." He frowned and said, "You don't understand business. You were never strong enough." I stepped forward and said, "You used to say that every time you took another piece of my life." The room went silent. Nina said, "The plaintiff was deliberately removed from his inheritance through pre-planned legal manipulation." Ryan slammed the table and said, "Lies." I looked at him and said, "You taught me how to trust the wrong person, and I learned how to see the truth." The judge reviewed the documents and said, "This evidence is valid and admissible." I saw Ryan's face change for the first time. He whispered, "No, this can't be happening." I said quietly, "It already happened, you just never saw it." Nina turned to me and said, "We are done." Ryan looked around the courtroom like he was searching for escape. He said, "Mom, tell them this is wrong." She didn't speak, she just looked down. That silence hurt him more than any evidence. He turned to her again and said, "Mom, please." She started crying and said, "I'm sorry, Ryan." His expression broke. He looked at me and said, "You ruined everything." I replied, "No, you did. I just stopped pretending." The judge announced the ruling confirming fraud and illegal manipulation of assets. Ryan stepped back like he couldn't breathe. He whispered my name, "Adam," slowly, like he didn't recognize who I had become. I looked at him and said, "You said I was weak. You were wrong." For the first time, he had no answer. Security approached him, and he didn't even resist. He just kept looking at me like he finally saw what he had created. As he was escorted out, he said softly, "I didn't think you would become this." I replied, "You made me this." The courtroom felt empty after that. Emily stood at the back watching everything silently. Her eyes were full of emotion, but she didn't speak. Mike was outside waiting. When I walked out, he said, "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded and said, "For him, yes." Mr. Harris stood beside me and said, "And for you?" I looked at the building behind me and said, "For me, it just began differently." Inside, I felt no celebration, no joy, only silence, a strange, peaceful emptiness. Emily came closer and said, "I'm sorry, Adam." I said, "Don't be sorry, just understand." She nodded slowly and said, "You're not the same person anymore." I replied, "I couldn't afford to be." She looked at me and said, "Was it worth it?" I paused and said, "I don't know yet." That honesty surprised even me. Ryan was gone from my life. In that moment, everything he built was collapsing legally, publicly, permanently. But I didn't feel like I had won. I only felt like I had survived something that changed me forever. As I walked away from the courtroom, I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't turn back. Mike said, "Where do we go now?" I looked forward and said, "Anywhere he is not." Mr. Harris added, "And who are you now?" I stopped for a moment and said, "Someone who learned what betrayal creates." And for the first time, I walked forward without looking back, because the man I used to be was not behind me anymore. He was something I had already buried. I noticed Ryan ignoring me completely at home. He barely looked at me when I said good morning. "Ryan," I said, "why are you acting like this?" He replied without looking up, "I am busy, Ethan." That tone hit me harder than I expected. Lucas started skipping time with me at school. I asked him, "Where are you going every day?" He laughed nervously. "Just new friends, man." New friends. I said, since when do I not matter? He avoided my eyes and walked away. That hurt more than I expected. Emily Scott tried to talk to me. You okay? She asked. I forced a smile. I am fine. But I was not fine. Buddy stayed beside me all night. I told him, something is wrong, Buddy. He barked softly. The next day I saw Ryan with Daniel Brooks. Daniel smiled like he owned everything. I walked closer and said, Ryan, we need to talk. Ryan finally looked at me and said, not now. Lucas stood beside them. Bro, why are you with them? I asked. He said, just trust me. I said, I do not trust this. He sighed and walked away. That hurt more than I expected. At home, Ryan ignored me again. I said, are you even my brother? He said coldly, stop asking questions. That night I walked outside and saw them talking. I whispered, something is wrong. Buddy followed me everywhere. I sat on the bench outside school. Lucas came near but stopped seeing me. I said, we need to talk, Lucas. He looked away. Not now. Why? I asked, are you ignoring me? He said, it is complicated. Since when do I become complicated? I said. He did not answer. Emily walked past slowly. She said softly, I wish I could help. I said, then help me. She looked down. That silence hurt more than words. At school, people started whispering. I heard my name again and again. Ryan walked past me in front of everyone. He said, stop following me, Ethan. Everyone laughed. My face burned. I stood frozen. That was the first time he humiliated me. I could not speak. Buddy barked from distance. I went home silent. Ryan was already inside. I asked, why did you do that? He said, you embarrassed yourself. I said, you are my brother. He said, that means nothing now. I felt broken. Buddy came to me. I hugged him. I whispered, I am alone. That night I could not sleep. I heard voices again. I walked slowly near Ryan's room. I stopped hearing Daniel's voice. He still trusts you. Ryan said, good. My heart dropped. I whispered, my future. Door opened suddenly. Ryan said, go away. I said, what are you hiding? He stared at me. Nothing, he said. I did not believe. I walked back slowly. Buddy followed me. I sat on bed. I thought everything was changing. I whispered, this is not my brother. Buddy slept beside me. I stared at ceiling. I remembered old days. Ryan laughing with me on roof. I whispered, where did you go? Morning came fast. I went school. Lucas avoided me again. Emily tried smile but failed. I said, everyone is leaving me. She said, I am sorry. I said, sorry does not fix anything. Ryan passed by without looking. I clenched fists. I followed him. I said, we need answers. He stopped. He said, stop chasing me. I said, you are my brother. He said, not anymore. That broke me. Buddy barked. I fell silent. I realized something was ending. I walked alone. I saw Ryan with Daniel again. Daniel smiled at me. I turned away. I whispered, I will find truth. Buddy stayed with me. I sat alone. I felt everything collapsing. I said, Ryan, why? No answer. I looked at sky. I said, I trusted you. Buddy rested head on my lap. I said, at least you stay. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned slowly. Lucas stood there. He said, Ethan, wait. I said, why? He said, I can explain. I said, then explain. He stayed silent. I shook head. I said, too late. Lucas stepped back. I walked away. I said, everyone changed. Buddy followed me. I stopped near gate. I saw Ryan inside Daniel group. Ryan looked at me. He did not smile. I whispered, this is not over. I felt something inside me break. I said, I will know everything. Buddy barked. I turned away. I walked home slowly. I felt empty. I said, Why is this happening to me? Buddy stayed close. I opened door and saw light from Ryan's room. I walked closer. I heard him typing. I said, Ryan. He stopped. I opened door. He quickly closed laptop. I said, what are you hiding from me? He said, nothing. I said, that is not true. He stared at me. Silence filled room. I felt truth slipping. I said, I will find out. Buddy barked. I stepped back. I said, you are my brother. He said, not anymore. I stood frozen. I turned away. Buddy followed me. I whispered, this is just beginning. Night came again. I lay on bed. I thought about Ryan. I thought about Lucas. I thought about everything. Buddy slept beside me. I whispered, I will survive. I closed eyes slowly. I felt pain turning into anger. I said, I am not weak. I promised myself truth no matter what. I will find truth always. I found out the betrayal at school when everything started falling apart around me. I walked into class feeling normal, but I heard two students talking behind me. One of them said that Ryan had already presented my project as his own in front of everyone. I stopped walking and turned around. I asked them, what did you just say about Ryan and my project? They laughed like it was nothing and said everyone already knew about it. My chest felt tight and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I kept repeating to myself that Ryan would never do something like that to me. I told myself there must be a mistake, but deep inside something already felt broken. I rushed out of the classroom and went straight to find Lucas because he always knew what was happening in school before me. I needed answers from him more than anyone else. I found Lucas near the cafeteria and I grabbed his arm, asking him directly if Ryan really took my project. He looked uncomfortable and tried to pull away while telling me it was not as simple as I thought. I asked him again why everyone was saying Ryan presented it. Lucas avoided my eyes and said Ryan only stepped in to present because I was not there. I shouted that it was still my work and he had no right. Lucas told me to calm down and not make it a big issue. I felt anger rising because he was not standing with me. I told him he was my best friend and he should believe me. Lucas stayed silent for a long moment and then said things change and I should accept it. Those words hurt more than I expected. I went to Emily Scott after that, hoping she would tell me the truth. I asked her if she knew what was happening with Ryan and my project. She looked nervous and kept avoiding my eyes. I told her I needed honesty, not sympathy. Emily finally said she did not want to get involved in drama between friends. I told her this was not drama. It was my life being taken away. She stayed quiet and that silence felt like another betrayal. I walked away feeling even more alone because I thought at least she would stand with me. Instead, she chose silence over truth and that hurt deeply. I went to Mr. Harrison after class because he was the only teacher I trusted. I told him that my project had been stolen and people were blaming me. He listened carefully and then said he had already been hearing strange things about Ryan presenting my work. I felt shocked and asked him if he believed it. He told me he was not sure yet, but warned me that something unfair was happening behind the scenes. I asked him what I should do, but he said I needed to stay calm and collect my thoughts. I left his office feeling confused because even adults were not giving me clear answers. Everything around me felt like it was slipping away and I could no longer trust anyone fully. The next day at school, rumors spread faster than I could control. People were whispering my name everywhere I went. Some said I copied Ryan while others said I was jealous of him. I tried to defend myself, but no one wanted to listen. Even teachers started looking at me differently as if I had already been proven guilty. I felt trapped inside my own school. I asked one student why they were saying those things and he said everyone heard it from Ryan himself. My stomach dropped because I realized the story was already against me and I was losing without even being heard properly. Later that day, I finally confronted Ryan in front of the school. He was standing with Daniel Brooks like nothing was wrong. I walked straight up to him and asked why he took credit for my project. Ryan looked at me coldly and asked what I was talking about. I told him he knew exactly what I meant and that everyone was saying he presented my work. Daniel smirked behind him while Lucas stood silently nearby. I felt my voice shaking, but I kept speaking, saying I had worked hard on it and he had no right to steal it. Ryan suddenly raised his voice and told me I was embarrassing myself in public. I shouted back that he was my brother and should not betray me like this. Lucas told me to stop, but I refused because I needed answers right there. The next day during school assembly, Ryan stepped forward in front of everyone. He said he needed to clear something about me. My heart started beating fast because I knew it would not be good. Ryan pointed at me and said I was lying about the project and taking credit for his work. The crowd went silent, then started whispering. I froze and shouted that it was not true and he was lying. Lucas stepped back without speaking and Emily covered her mouth in shock. Daniel stood behind smiling like he planned everything. Ryan said I was jealous and ruining his name. I felt my world collapsing as everyone looked at me like I was guilty. I knew everything had changed forever. I walked into school that morning and felt the air was different. People were already staring at me before I even reached my classroom. One boy whispered, "That's him, Ryan's brother." Another laughed, "The liar one." I stopped and said, "What did you say?" He smirked, "Ask your brother." My chest tightened. I kept walking, but every step felt heavier. Lucas was standing near the corridor with Daniel Brooks. I went straight to him. I said, "Lucas, why are they talking like this?" He didn't look at me. "Just ignore it, Ethan. Ignore it," I said. "My name is being destroyed." Daniel chuckled behind him. "Some people can't handle truth." I turned to Daniel. "Stay out of this." He smiled. "I already am in it." Lucas finally said, "Ethan, stop making it worse for yourself." I stared at him. "You used to call me your brother." He hesitated. That hesitation said everything. At lunch, I sat alone. No one came near me. Even the empty chair beside me felt loud. Emily walked up slowly. She said softly, "Can I sit?" I nodded. "You're the only one who still talks to me." She looked uncomfortable. "Ethan, I don't know what's true anymore." I said, "So you believe them?" She shook her head. "I don't know what to believe." That hit harder than an insult. I said, "Then at least don't leave me." She stayed silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I think I need space." I laughed once. "Everyone needs space from me now." She looked down. "I'm sorry." And she walked away. That was the moment I felt it completely. I was alone. Buddy was waiting at home like always. When I opened the door, he ran straight to me. I dropped my bag and said, "At least you don't lie." He wagged his tail. I sat on the floor and said, "Everyone is gone, Buddy. Everyone." He rested his head on my lap. I whispered, "What did I do wrong?" That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing voices from school. "Liar. Ryan is right. Stay away from him." Covered my ears. "Stop." But it didn't stop. Next day, Mr. Harrison called me after class. He said, "Ethan, sit down." I asked, "Do you also believe I cheated?" He sighed. "I didn't say that." I said, "But you think it." He leaned forward. "I think something is being controlled behind the scenes." I said, "By who?" He paused. "Your brother is involved in something bigger than you realize." I felt my stomach drop. I said, "So it is true." He said, "Truth takes time." I stood up. "Truth is destroying me right now." He said quietly, "Don't lose yourself trying to prove it." I walked out without replying. In the hallway, I saw Ryan. He was laughing with Lucas. People surrounded them. Someone said, "Ryan is so smart." Another said, "His brother tried to copy him." I stepped forward. I said, "Stop it." Everyone turned. Ryan looked at me calmly. He said, "You still don't understand, do you?" I said, "Understand what? That you ruined me?" He walked closer. "You ruined yourself." I clenched my fists. "You took everything." Lucas whispered, "Ethan, stop." I looked at him. "You too." He avoided my eyes again. That hurt more than anything Ryan could say. Daniel clapped slowly. He said, "This is entertaining." I turned to him. "You're behind this." He smiled. "Prove it." Couldn't. And that made me weaker in front of everyone. People started laughing again. "Look at him. So desperate." I felt my face burning. Ryan said quietly, Go home, Ethan. I whispered. You're my brother. He replied, not anymore. That broke something inside me. That night I sat outside with Buddy. I said, they're all against me now. Buddy stayed close. I said, even Emily left. I looked at the sky. Even Lucas. I closed my eyes. Then I remembered small things. Ryan suddenly getting close to Daniel. Lucas changing after their meetings. Emily's hesitation. It wasn't random. I stood up suddenly. I said, this was planned. Buddy barked. I said, they didn't turn against me. They were turned. My hands were shaking. I whispered, Ryan, what are you doing? That night something changed inside me. I stopped crying. I stopped hoping. I said quietly, I won't ask anymore. I looked at Buddy. I will find the truth myself. And for the first time, my silence wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of something else. If you want, I can now tighten this into a perfect 900-word verified version. Or continue chapter 5 with even darker escalation and full revenge setup. I walked into school that morning and felt the air was different. People were already staring at me before I even reached my classroom. One boy whispered, that's him, Ryan's brother. Another laughed, the liar one. I stopped and said, what did you say? He smirked, ask your brother. My chest tightened. I kept walking, but every step felt heavier. Lucas was standing near the corridor with Daniel Brooks. I went straight to him. I said, Lucas, why are they talking like this? He didn't look at me. Just ignore it, Ethan. Ignore it, I said. My name is being destroyed. Daniel chuckled behind him. Some people can't handle truth. I turned to Daniel. Stay out of this. He smiled. I already am in it. Lucas finally said, Ethan, stop making it worse for yourself. I stared at him. You used to call me your brother. He hesitated. That hesitation said everything. At lunch, I sat alone. No one came near me. Even the empty chair beside me felt loud. Emily walked up slowly. She said softly, can I sit? I nodded. You're the only one who still talks to me. She looked uncomfortable. Ethan, I don't know what's true anymore. I said, so you believe them? She shook her head. I don't know what to believe. That hit harder than an insult. I said, then at least don't leave me. She stayed silent for a long moment. Then she said, I think I need space. I laughed once. Everyone needs space from me now. She looked down. I'm sorry. And she walked away. That was the moment I felt it completely. I was alone. Buddy was waiting at home like always. When I opened the door, he ran straight to me. I dropped my bag and said, at least you don't lie. He wagged his tail. I sat on the floor and said, everyone is gone, Buddy. Everyone. He rested his head on my lap. I whispered, what did I do wrong? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing voices from school. Liar. Ryan is right. Stay away from him. Covered my ears. Stop. But it didn't stop. Next day, Mr. Harrison called me after class. He said, Ethan, sit down. I asked, do you also believe I cheated? He sighed. I didn't say that. I said, but you think it. He leaned forward. I think something is being controlled behind the scenes. I said, by who? He paused. Your brother is involved in something bigger than you realize. I felt my stomach drop. I said, so it is true. He said, truth takes time. I stood up. Truth is destroying me right now. He said quietly, don't lose yourself trying to prove it. I walked out without replying. In the hallway, I saw Ryan. He was laughing with Lucas. People surrounded them. Someone said, Ryan is so smart. Another said, his brother tried to copy him. I stepped forward. I said, stop it. Everyone turned. Ryan looked at me calmly. He said, you still don't understand, do you? I said, understand what? That you ruined me? He walked closer. You ruined yourself. I clenched my fists. You took everything. Lucas whispered, Ethan, stop. I looked at him. You too. He avoided my eyes again. That hurt more than anything Ryan could say. Daniel clapped slowly. He said, "This is entertaining." I turned to him. "You're behind this." He smiled. "Prove it." Couldn't. And that made me weaker in front of everyone. People started laughing again. Look at him. So desperate. I felt my face burning. Ryan said quietly, "Go home, Ethan." I whispered, "You're my brother." He replied, "Not anymore." That broke something inside me. That night I sat outside with Buddy. I said, "They're all against me now." Buddy stayed close. I said, "Even Emily left." I looked at the sky. Even Lucas. I closed my eyes. Then I remembered small things. Ryan suddenly getting close to Daniel. Lucas changing after their meetings. Emily's hesitation. It wasn't random. I stood up suddenly. I said, "This was planned." Buddy barked. I said, "They didn't turn against me. They were turned." My hands were shaking. I whispered, "Ryan, what are you doing?" That night something changed inside me. I stopped crying. I stopped hoping. I said quietly, "I won't ask anymore." I looked at Buddy. "I will find the truth myself." And for the first time, my silence wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of something else. If you want, I can now tighten this into a perfect 900-word verified version. Or continue chapter 5 with even darker escalation and full revenge setup. I began secretly gathering evidence about Ryan, Lucas, and Daniel. I stopped trusting everyone and started watching everything carefully. Noah Blake approached me one day and said he wanted to help quietly. I asked him, "Why would you help me?" He replied, "Because I know you are not lying." I said, "Everyone else thinks I am." He said, "Everyone is wrong then." I started staying away from everyone at school and focusing only on small clues. Buddy stayed beside me every night and never left my side. I told him, "At least you are still loyal to me." He barked softly like he understood everything I felt. I discovered Daniel was controlling Ryan using money and promises of power. Lucas started avoiding me completely whenever Daniel was around. I said to Lucas, "Why are you doing this to me?" He looked away and said, "It is not what you think." Emily tried to talk to me again, but I did not trust her fully. She said, "I want to fix things between us." I replied, "Some things cannot be fixed anymore." She walked away silently without saying anything else. I spent nights thinking about everything that happened. I realized I was changing into someone colder and more focused. I said to myself, I cannot trust anyone anymore. One night, I followed Daniel secretly after school. I saw him giving money to Lucas behind the building. I whispered, "So this is how it works." Buddy growled softly beside me as I watched everything. I felt something break inside me completely that night. I said, "They were never my friends." I decided I would no longer wait for justice from anyone. I will find truth myself even if I must walk alone. Noah told me, "You cannot trust them anymore." I asked him, "Then what should I do?" He said, "Watch, wait, and collect truth slowly." I nodded and said, "I will not be fooled again." Buddy stayed with me even when I stopped talking to everyone. I said, "You are the only one I trust now." He barked once like he agreed with everything. I followed every small clue I could find about Ryan. I whispered, "This is bigger than I thought." Lucas avoided me completely in school corridors. I said, "Lucas, look at me." He said, "I cannot right now." I said, "You chose them over me." He said nothing and walked away. Emily said softly, "I wish things were different." I replied, "Wishing does not change reality." She looked at me sadly and left. Mr. Harrison said, "Truth always comes out." I said, "Then why am I losing everything?" He said, "Because truth is not fast." I walked home alone after school. Buddy ran to me immediately when I opened the door. I said, "They are breaking me slowly." He rested his head on my lap. I said, "I need to understand everything." I watched the ceiling thinking about Ryan. I said, he planned all of this. Lucas is no longer my friend, I whispered. I felt anger growing inside me every day. I said, I will not beg anymore. Noah said, then build your own truth. I replied, I already started. Buddy stayed close as I made my decision. I said, no one will control me again. I watched Ryan from far away in silence. I said, this ends differently. Emily tried one last time to speak to me. I said, do not come back. She left without answering. I stood alone with Buddy beside me. I said, from now on I trust no one. Noah replied, good, because you need clarity. I said, I will uncover everything. Buddy barked as if agreeing. I looked at the school one last time. I said, this place made me weak. I turned away forever from them. I said, I choose truth over everything. Buddy followed me as I walked away. I whispered, this is my silent decision. Noah said, you are changing now. I said, I had no choice. He said, everyone has a choice. I said, not when betrayal is everywhere. Buddy stayed close and never left. I said, I am done asking why. Noah replied, then start building answers. I said, I already am. I looked at everything I lost. I said, I will not forgive easily. I will let them face consequences. Buddy barked softly beside me. I said, they chose this path. Noah said, be careful from here. I replied, I am already careful. I walked into night alone. Buddy followed silently. I said, this is my new life. I felt no fear anymore. I said, truth is all I have. I looked back once at everything. I said, goodbye to lies. Buddy stayed beside me always. I said, I will never be the same. Noah said, then become stronger. I replied, I already am stronger. I walked forward without looking back. Buddy followed me into the dark. I said, this is only the beginning. I stood at the road feeling empty. I said, everything I knew is gone. Buddy pressed against me quietly. I said, now I choose my path. Noah said, walk it carefully. I replied, I will. I whispered, no mercy for betrayal. Buddy barked once in agreement. I said, this is my silent decision. I walked away from everything I knew and chose truth no matter the cost and never looked back. I stood in the dim room feeling the weight of truth rising inside me. They think I am still broken, I said softly to Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison nodded and said, careful now, we need proof, not noise. Noah stepped forward, placing the files on the table, and whispered, everything is ready. I looked at the evidence and felt my control returning slowly. Emily had texted me earlier saying, I was wrong. I did not reply because I needed silence more than words. Ryan walked in, slamming the door, and said, what the hell is going on here? Lucas followed him looking unsure and asked, why are you doing this? I smiled faintly and said, you all built this mess, I am just showing it. Mr. Harrison placed another document down and said, let him continue. Ryan snapped, you think you are smart? I replied, no, I think I am honest. Lucas whispered, we trusted you. I said, trust was already broken before I spoke. Noah added, we have everything recorded. Ryan turned pale and said, you are done. I leaned forward and said, no, Ryan, I am just starting. Emily entered the room and said, stop this, please. I looked at her and said, you left when it mattered. She lowered her eyes and said, I regret it. Lucas shouted, this is insane. I said calmly, no, this is truth. Ryan laughed bitterly and said, you will regret this. Mr. Harrison said, enough, listen to him. Noah showed the final file and said, this is everything. I took a breath and said, soon you will see everything. Ryan stared at me and said, who are you really? I answered, the one you underestimated. Lucas stepped back and said, I think he planned all this. I said, yes, I did. Mr. Harrison said, Then we proceed carefully. I nodded and said, we reveal it step by step. Noah opened another folder and said, this proves their plan. Ryan shouted, this is fake. I replied, then explain this. Lucas looked down and said, I cannot believe it. Emily whispered, I should have stayed. I said, it is too late for should have. Mr. Harrison said, focus on facts. Noah said, we have more recordings. Ryan looked furious and said, you set me up. I said, you set yourself up. Lucas said, what happens now? I said, now truth spreads. Emily said, please stop this. I said, I cannot stop what already started. Ryan said, you are destroying everything. I said, no, I am rebuilding it. Mr. Harrison said, stay calm, everyone. Noah said, final evidence ready. I said, then show them. Noah projected the files on the screen and said, look closely. Ryan stepped forward and said, this cannot be true. Lucas said, it matches everything. Emily said, I am sorry I left. I said, sorry does not erase actions. Mr. Harrison said, continue the sequence. Noah said, this next part is critical. Ryan said, you ruined my life. I said, you did that yourself. Lucas said, I cannot defend this. Emily said, I should help fix it. I said, then start telling truth. Ryan said, you are all against me. Mr. Harrison said, no, we are against lies. Noah said, we are almost done. I said, then finish it. Daniel entered quietly and said, what is going on? I looked at him and said, you finally arrived. Daniel frowned and said, what have you done? I said, I exposed everything. Daniel said, you are behind this. I said, yes, I am. Ryan said, I will destroy you. I said, you already tried. Lucas said, I do not know who to trust. Emily said, trust him. Mr. Harrison said, we need calm. Noah said, evidence speaks for itself. Daniel said, I see it now. I said, then you understand. Ryan said, this is betrayal. Lucas said, this is truth. Emily said, I am sorry, everyone. I said, sorry does not fix damage. Daniel stepped closer and said, you planned all of this. I said, yes, and I waited. Daniel said, why? I said, because truth needed timing. Ryan said, you will regret this day. Lucas said, I already regret everything. Emily said, what happens now? I said, now I stop. Mr. Harrison said, and justice. Noah said, it is done. Daniel said, I cannot believe you were behind everything. I said, I warned you all. Ryan said, this is not over. Lucas said, it feels over for me. Emily said, I want peace. I said, then choose truth. Daniel said, I understand now everything. I said, good, because this was necessary. Mr. Harrison said, we end this here. Noah said, finally. I said, no, this is just the beginning. Daniel said, you changed everything. Ryan said, I will come back. Lucas said, I am done. Emily said, I choose differently now. I said, then we are finished. Mr. Harrison said, go forward. Noah said, we succeeded. Daniel said, I will remember this. I said, good memory builds change. Ryan said, you cannot escape consequences. Lucas said, we all have consequences. Emily said, I accept mine. I said, then truth wins. Daniel said, I see the truth now. I said, that is enough. Mr. Harrison said, we are done here. Noah said, it worked. I looked around the room and said, this is the truth I wanted all along. No one spoke because everything finally made sense to me at last. I walked away quietly satisfied finally. I stood alone outside the school gate feeling the silence after everything collapsed. Daniel said, I cannot stand with Ryan anymore. I heard him say earlier in my mind. I said softly. So even Daniel turned away. Mr. Harrison said, Truth always breaks weak bonds. Noah replied, Ryan is losing control everywhere now. I said, and Lucas? Noah said, trying to apologize, but you are not answering him. I said, he chose this path himself. Emily walked in and said, I am standing with you now. I looked at her and said, you were silent when I needed you. She said, I know and I regret it deeply. Mr. Harrison said, this is the final confirmation of truth. I said, then everything is finally exposed. Lucas came forward saying, I need to explain myself to you. I said, you already made your choice. Lucas said, I was wrong and I see it now. Ryan shouted from afar, you destroyed everything I built. I said, you destroyed it yourself long before me. Daniel appeared and said, I understand now what you did. I said, then you finally see the truth. Emily said, I will stand publicly with you. Mr. Harrison said, this collapse was inevitable. Noah said, Ryan is trying to hide everything now. I said, he cannot hide from consequences anymore. Lucas said, please just listen to me once. I said, I listened when it mattered most and you did not. Ryan confronted me saying, you think you have won? I said, I did not win. I just revealed truth. Ryan said, I have nothing left now. I said, that is what happens when lies collapse. Emily whispered, I wish I had stayed earlier. I said, wishing does not rebuild broken trust. Daniel said, everything is over for us. I said, not over, just transformed. Mr. Harrison said, we end the collapse here. Noah said, all evidence has been revealed. I said, final line, I feel both relief and sadness. Ryan said, you will regret this moment forever. I said, regret belongs to those who ignored truth. Lucas said, I lost everything because of this. I said, you lost it when you chose sides. Emily said, can we ever fix this? I said, some things are not meant to be fixed. Daniel said, you changed all of us. I said, truth changes everyone differently. Noah said, what now? I said, now we move forward. Mr. Harrison said, the school will never be the same. I said, neither will we. Ryan said quietly, I have lost everything I built. I said, then you understand the cost of lies. Lucas said, I do not know who I am anymore. I said, you will find yourself only in truth. Emily said, I choose truth now. I said, then we are finally free. Daniel said, I will remember everything. I said, memory is what builds the future. Noah said, it is done for real this time. Ryan said, I will come back stronger. I said, strength without truth is empty. Lucas said, I am sorry for everything. I said, sorry is only the start. Emily said, I will prove I changed. I said, then prove it with actions. Daniel said, everything we had is gone. I said, no, only lies are gone. Mr. Harrison said, this is the end of deception. Noah said, and the beginning of something better. I said, I agree, but it hurts. Ryan said, you destroyed my life completely. I said, your choices built that destruction. Lucas said, I cannot forgive myself. I said, then start by changing. Emily said, I will stay this time. I said, stay means action now. Daniel said, I finally see everything clearly. I said, then the collapse was worth it. Noah said, we should leave this place. I said, yes, but not the truth. Ryan said faintly, I have nothing left at all. I said, then you are finally free from lies. Lucas said, I will rebuild myself. I said, rebuild with truth this time. Emily said, I am not afraid anymore. I said, fear ends when truth begins. Daniel said, I understand why you did this. I said, because silence was worse. Noah said, This is the last moment here. I said, then let it end properly. Ryan said, I lost everything I had. I said, you lost it when truth arrived. Lucas said, goodbye to the old us. I said, hello to what comes next. Emily said, I choose a better path. I said, then walk it fully. Daniel said, everything is finally clear now. I said, clarity comes after collapse. Noah said, we succeeded in truth. I said, and I feel it deeply. Ryan said, I am gone from this place. I watched him leave knowing everything had finally collapsed into truth.